Okay, so this is the second part of the last chapter. "Watch this, George," Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half-minute she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Look at her here. She's really tiny. Grandma's tiny face still bore the same foul and furious expression that it always had. Her eyes, no bigger now than little keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you'd been a glorious giant a minute ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully, "and she's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and she cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" There she is in Mrs. Cranky's hands. "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a matchstick and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then, look at this picture. She starts off and she just gets smaller and smaller. Then, "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens to you if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yes," Mr. Cranky said, "she most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. There's Mrs. Cranky. And then here's George and the tiny little hen. And that's it. That's the end. What an amazing book. I love that book. I hope you enjoyed it too.